You are listening to the Down the Wormhole podcast, exploring the strange and fascinating relationship between science and religion. This week, our hosts are...
My name is Adam Pryor. I work at Bethany College in Lindsborg, Kansas. I hope that when I die, someone will put me in the mushroom burial suit invented by Jim Ray Lee.
Ian Benz, Associate Professor of Elementary Science Education at UNC Charlotte. And let's see, I would be cremated and put into the hilt of the first real lightsaber.
Rachel Jackson, Agudas Israel Congregation, Hendersonville, North Carolina. And after I die, I want a traditional Jewish burial. So buried in some sort of decomposing box. I don't really care if it's pine or cardboard. And yeah, just to be buried in the ground. Nothing, just simple.
Zach Jackson, UCC pastor in Reading, Pennsylvania, and when I die, I want to be composted.
Kendra Holtmore, PhD candidate at Boston University, and when I die, I want half of my body to be pressed into a gemstone that will become an heirloom of my family, and the other half of my body will be buried in one of those tree pods that grows into a forest. I can't remember the name of the person who invented these tree pods, but it's a similar idea, I think, to the mushroom suit, but you become a forest of death.
That is oddly specific.
Yeah. There's a wonderful story in Greek mythology about that.
With the forest of death.
I just want to point out that all of you came up with something like somewhat reasonable. I mean, I just wanted to play. How cool would that be? Instead of being like displayed on someone's, mantle in a box or an urn, that could be displayed as a lightsaber hilt. There you go.
Or I can just give my carbon back to the earth that sustained me.
Yeah, see, I mean, that's probably what will happen, but I wanted to fantasize.
I'm hung up on the gemstone, so.
Okay, Kendra, tell us about death.
I know, which half of you is going to be a gemstone, I wonder.
I'll leave that up to the...
The left half?
Is it like a personal thing? Like certain parts are you...
The person chopping you up? I thought they would split out the ashes and put it together.
That's not what I envisioned.
No, this arm, and how about this foot? And just...
That's absolutely the way this has to go now. It's like, don't cremate and turn you into a diamond. Just take your arms and legs and squish them and see what happens.
Yeah, let's just squeeze them all together.
Right.
You're going to create a gemstone.
Yeah, whichever parts of me would make the best gemstone. So, death. I guess this is a good segue. It's as good as it's going to get. So we're talking about death today, and there's so much that we could talk about. So let me just say that I think that death is a pretty fun subject to talk about, mostly because a lot of my own work is about death, at least implicitly. So it's just so a lot of the stuff that I do comes out of this social psychological theory called terror management theory, and that's terror, not what people often. Some people hear me say that and they think I am saying terror management theory or tarot management theory. But no, it's terror, Terror, you're terrified.
I do like tarot.
Yeah.
Tarot, that sounds kind of cool.
Yeah, that's a different thing. But terror management theory is a theory that was first proposed in the 80s by social psychologists. And there's a lot that has been done over the last several decades on it. But the basic idea is that when people are primed to think about death, or they're exposed to some kind of trigger that causes them to reflect on death, and there are explicit and implicit ways of doing this, but basically these death triggers, or what they would call mortality salience triggers, they make us more defensive. And these defense mechanisms can look a lot of different ways, but the basic idea is that like people don't want to die, whether we're talking about physical death or even like a more like metaphorical, figurative kind of death. So think, apart from dying in your body, maybe you're also another kind of death would be like total social isolation and exclusion. That's a kind of like social death. So there's something that it's not, we're not just talking about like physical death, even though that's a huge part of it, but also, a kind of ego death, if you will, where what it means to be human, the connectedness we feel in community, like there are ways of dying that disconnect us from those pieces of what it means to be human as well. So anyway, terror management theory is something that touches on all these different kinds of death and shows how people become more defensive of the things that are meaningful to them or the things that make us feel like we have a purpose and a sense of significance in the world. And when we don't have those things, those ties of significance, those like foundational building blocks of meaning and community and purpose, that we are a lot more vulnerable to like psychological dysfunction and other forms of dysfunction and even death. And so there's, all kinds of ways of testing this. But just to give like one example of what this means is there was a study years ago where a group of researchers, they took a group of Christians and they divided the Christians in half. And half of the Christians were exposed to some kind of mortality salience or like death trigger. And usually that's a couple of questions where you're being asked explicitly to reflect on what you think about death, like what you think will happen to your body when you die, stuff like that. And then the other half of the Christians were not asked those questions. And then all of the Christians were brought back together and given a series of questionnaires in which they were asked to evaluate an outgroup. In this case, that outgroup was another separate group of Jewish people. And what they found was that the Christian group who had been exposed to the mortality salience trigger, that they had slightly harsher evaluations against the Jewish group than the half of the Christians that were not exposed to a death trigger. And so this is like, first of all, just to say this has nothing to do with like implicit, like inherently being like Christian or Jewish. Like you could have put in like Canadian, American, like any kind of like identifier. But this goes to show that like religion is often a very like salient and important and strong form of identification for people. But what this showed was that, whenever we're threatened in some way with these like ideas of death, that we really, we want to like strengthen our in-group markers, and we become a little bit more suspicious of ideas or people or communities that are different from us or that threaten what we see as like the nature of the universe, the order of the cosmos. And so this is just like one example in hundreds of studies that have been done at this point that show this idea. And like I said, you could do this with a number of things, but I chose the religious example because of, well, what our conversations usually turn to. So the point, though, is just to say, like, we as people, we think about death a lot. And we, a lot of what we do in our lives, we're trying to, like, make meaning and like find a sense of belonging in the world. And that death is just like part of being human. And it's something that at some point we will have to think about more explicitly and have to really reckon with. And so that is just like some background, I guess, into like why this last episode in our, what is this series? Medical ethics? Is that?
Loosely.
That is correct.
But yeah, just to give a little background onto like how to like orient to this conversation about like the nature of death, the concept of death, and how it can be a really powerful motivator of human behavior. And so, yeah, I guess like one of the stories that I was thinking about, and this is sort of transitioning into a slightly different direction than what I was just talking about, but I was thinking a lot about the death with dignity movement this week. And that, for those who don't know, like there's a lot of, I think every year there's still like ongoing discussion and debate about how this looks in policy. But the state of Oregon was the first state to implement a policy. I can't remember the year, if anyone knows that off the top of their head. Feel free to say, but we can find that later. But Oregon was the first state to implement a policy in which people who were terminally ill are able to ask for a lethal dose of medication to end their lives so that they don't have to suffer, and that the purpose of this policy was to give terminally ill patients a sense of control and a sense of, dignity and normalcy in their last days with family. And so the story that I had read long ago was a woman named Brittany Maynard, I'm not sure exactly how to say her name, but she died by this voluntary lethal dose of medication I think in 2014. But before that, she had been diagnosed with an aggressive brain cancer. And she was 29, and she and her husband, they were young, and they knew that there was nothing that was going to save her. And brain cancer is, it's a horrifying thing to go through, and would lead to a lot of suffering and a lot of deterioration in her body and in her like mental capability and personality. And she didn't want her family to have to watch her suffer that way. And she didn't want to, sorry, my alarm's going off here. And she didn't want to suffer that way. And so she and her husband established residency in Oregon so that she could participate in the Death with Dignity Act. And so anyway, this has led to a lot of conversations in a lot of different like religious communities and medical communities about like what this means, like what are the implications of something like this. And this is just like one example in medicine of like conversations about death. Like there are other things that, we could talk about of like defining what death even is, because that has changed over the years as well. But I was thinking a lot about this conversation because there's something that seems almost like paradoxical, I guess, about it, and I think that's part of what the controversy brings out is we feel like, especially many people from religious communities who say, well, all life is sacred and we should, stand by the sanctity of human life and things like that. And so how does something like the Death with Dignity Act violate that principle or even, uphold it? And so I just wanted to like make that our example and to maybe see, especially like the clergy in the room, if what this has looked like in your communities, if this is something that you've come across and how that conversation has played out. Because when I think about it, I think a lot about how, in like my academic work, what it means to look at something like the death with dignity, like assisted suicide issue, and how that is a way of like fighting death or like, is it a way of fighting death or giving in to death? I think that's sort of the controversy here, and that there's like a lot of different ways to sort of analyze and interpret what this very personal decision actually means. And it's just so interesting because you can really understand it, I think, from several different angles, that it's like a fight against the suffering and the humiliation that the dying process can bring, so that you maybe like remain in your friends and family's memories as a vital, like, healthy person, whereas other people see it as like maybe a kind of giving up. And it's just like, so it's such a personal issue. And so yeah, that's what I wanted to just sort of set on the table to get us going.
These are really great things that you're talking about, Kendra. And I'll say that I have taught about dignity and death from a Jewish perspective. And I want to throw in a couple, you posed a couple of dichotomies, and I think there's far more, there's several other dichotomies as well. And so I just want to look at that. When we think about death, dignity in dying, right, which is a better terminology than physician-assisted suicide, right, we're giving somebody dignity. Well, we have to ask ourselves the questions that in the last 100 years, we have progressed in our medical intervention in such incredible ways that we prolong people's lives. Right? I mean, that's vaccines, antibiotics, surgery, right? Just simple things like that, that have prolonged people's life. So from my perspective, there's really this question of, are we prolonging suffering? And is suffering part of life? And what part of it, right? So those pieces. And I feel I have to live into the role that I have set up for myself, and I want to share a story. If that is okay. This comes from Talmud, of course, because that's where I like to quote a lot of. And if anyone wants the full citation, Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Ketubot, page 104a. And this will lead into part of the conversation that I was thinking. A maidservant of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi went to the roof and said, "The upper realms are requesting the presence of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, and the lower realms are requesting the presence of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. May it be the will of God that the lower worlds should impose their will upon the upper worlds." However, when she saw how many times he would enter the bathroom, remove his phylacteries, exit, put them back on, and how he was suffering so with his intestinal disease, she said, "May it be the will of God that the upper worlds should impose their will upon the lower worlds." And the sages, meanwhile, would not be silent, meaning they would not refrain from begging for mercy so that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi would not die. So she took a jug, threw it from the roof to the ground. And due to the sudden noise, the sages were momentarily silent and refrained from their begging of mercy. And in that moment, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi died. So we use this in modernity. We use this story to say, who are we doing this for? Who are we prolonging the life and therefore the suffering for? Is it because we can't bear to let this person die? Or is it because that's what is necessary? So that's one way we use this story. The second way we use this understanding is from an ethical standpoint. Medical ethics has this idea of personal autonomy, resources, use of adequate resources, and do no harm, non-maleficence. If a person is clearly suffering, is it not the job of the physician to do no harm? right? So we really have to understand, are we causing harm by allowing someone to live? So having said that, a couple of case questions that I was thinking about. If there is a person who has, the example that Kendra gave, right? So this woman has a brain tumor. Let's say she now develops completely incidentally, just randomly, has nothing to do with the brain tumor. She develops severe bronchitis that turns into aspirational pneumonia, right? Do you treat the pneumonia? Non-rhetorical. Do you treat the pneumonia? We're not touching the brain tumor. We're not doing anything. Do you treat pneumonia?
I would still defer to the patient's wishes. If the patient says, "Hey, I don't want you to treat my pneumonia," and then I could probably argue against that.
It's you.
Oh. Well, probably. Especially if I've made the decision that I'm going to continue on with my life as long as I possibly can until the cancer finally gets me, then yeah, I would treat it.
Okay. Zach?
If, as a doctor, you do what the patient wants, but if it were me, I don't know if I would. I might see that as a grace.
Kendra or Adam?
Yeah, I guess it depends how much time I thought I had left, but I'm inclined to answer, I guess, similarly to Zach, that maybe I would, if I still had like a good bit of quality of life left. So yeah, I guess I would lean more towards yes.
I don't have enough information to decide. No, I mean, that was too cheeky.
All the information you have. So
no, what I think about are the answer I might give to that question look very different when I am 29 versus 39 versus 49 versus 59. It looks really different depending on what my familial situation looks like. And to me, it also looks really different based on the specific type of brain cancer and its prognosis. So there's a spectrum of I might answer yes or no.
Could go either way.
What about you, Rachel?
Could go either way. If I were the patient in this case, I would not treat the pneumonia.
Can you explain why?
Yeah. If I know I'm going to die soon, right? We're all going to die. But if I know that I'm going to die, and it's going to be a terrible dying experience, I wouldn't want to leave that for anyone, including myself. Pneumonia is considered old man's friend, right?
Right. That's why I mentioned it. I see it as a grace.
Yeah.
But I would still want it not to be cured, but I feel like I would want some kind of comfort at least in it, because you're basically drowning.
You are. Yeah, you are. I mean, that's the difference, right? You can cure most people. I shouldn't say most times. Pneumonia has the ability to be cured, right? It's not an automatic death sentence if you get pneumonia, but there are plenty of symptom relief things that you can also take. It's also just like have enough morphine that you don't care. You don't feel any of it. I bring this up because there are real life examples, right? They're real life, right? There's a responsa that we look at. Responsa is the Jewish way of saying, hey, I have this question that doesn't actually have an answer. Hey, rabbis, can you give me an answer? Where it talks about a 95-year-old woman who has Alzheimer's, severe Alzheimer's. And they compare that to a 16-month-old who has severe Canavan's disease, right? Both of them will die within the year. What do you do with them? Does their happiness matter? Does how long they live matter? What matters when we make these decisions? And who is making these decisions, right? In the case that Kendra provided for the death and dignity, the patient themselves is making the call. Oftentimes, when we are faced with questions like this, the patient themselves is not the one capable of making that call. for one reason or another. Again, in terms of the death dignity in Oregon and Washington, Oregon, I just looked up my notes, was 97. Washington was 09. So both those two states have it. And in those cases, the patient themselves must be the one. It cannot be a guardian. And there's lots of doctors involved and psychologists. And it has to be a hospice situation of 6 months or less, verified by multiple doctors. I mean, it's really above board. This is not the 1990s Kevorkian questions, which is a different question entirely. But I know that that's clouded those of us that remember those years very differently than these laws in Washington State and Oregon. So I think it's all of those pieces. And then when we look at the question of what are we doing for prolonging life, if someone, what is death? So let me just answer that real quickly. I know I'm jumping all around, and for our listeners, I apologize that I'm just sort of chunking my statements here. I unfortunately will have to exit and leave this wonderful conversation. So I just want to put in a couple more thoughts.
Without Rachel, it's going to turn dark.
It's going to get dark.
Just biting my
it's
tongue.
going to get dark. So I'll have to listen to your statements when they come out then. What do we classify as death? A long time ago, it was when you stop breathing, and then it became when you stopped having a heartbeat, and then it's when your brain ceases to have brain waves, right? And that's where we're at now, is brainwave death. So if your heart is still beating, your body is technically living, alive, but your brain is not and cannot be. We don't have a way to resurrect that. So what do we understand death to be? And this is where I see hope in our society. This is where I'm hoping we will get to go, that rather than asking these questions of being that we're removing the sanctity of life, we're redefining what life can be. So here's the optimism that you're just going to have to hold on to for just a little bit, because I can't end the episode this way because I'm not going to be there. But it's optimism that rather than being afraid of death, which is what so much of our society is dealing with, and as a clergy person, facing one's mortality is a question that we face a lot. And I know other clergy are the same way. And recognizing that, bring on the Lion King. It's the circle of life. It's the circle of life where we're really looking at life, and that death is just a part of that. So getting down and drilling down, what are the things that we're afraid of? And it's often a fear of difficulty in dying, or it's often a fear of an afterlife for some people. So that's not, it's not just death that we're afraid of. In our society, with all these medical techniques, we have the ability to say, okay, now we have the control. Right? We have the ability to, how are we using that control? How are we taking ownership of ourselves and our life, which includes this portion of death? So that's all for me. Good luck.
Well, I'll jump on the religious aspect, because the United Church of Christ actually has made statements about this topic. Because, of course, we have.
You guys make statements on a lot of topics, right? Most topics. That's not a complaint. That's just
no. And you know why we do that is because the United Church of Christ is a congregational denomination, which means that the national setting has no power to enforce anything on local churches. So when we get together every other year for General Synod and we make these grand statements of witness and whatnot, there's no actual accountability that has to come with that. We can just say these things and then send it to a committee to make a study on it and send out materials to churches. And so unlike other denominations where when they say something, they actually have to do something about it, we can just say a lot of things. So that's kind of nice. But we did, in 2007, have a resolution on the, the resolution was called Legalization of Physician Aid in Dying. And as a result of that, they voted in to affirm this, which sent it to a committee to do research on the topic and to create a 6-week study guide for small groups in churches. It was designed to be used during Lent, which is a time in which traditionally we imagine ourselves in the tomb with Christ and looking forward to resurrection. And so it's very theologically focused. And we'll put a link in the show notes. But, one of the things that it really focuses on is that Christians should not be afraid of death. Death and resurrection is kind of our thing. Like, it's an important part of the Christian tradition and story. And so if we believe that death is not a final thing, but a transition into something else, then how one's life ends is not all that important. And so whether that person dies by natural causes or dies in physician-assisted ways, it is still a transition into what is next. And we believe that people are more than just their physical bodies. And so keeping a physical body alive is not inherently more virtuous than allowing a physical body to die. And so we came down on the side of supporting, but also in an informed way.
Zach, just to get out a clarifying question, maybe, because I think a lot of what we've been talking about is, the policies and statements that are for this kind of, choice in deliberating like how someone wants to die. But just in case there's any confusion for people who didn't grow up in a community where there was a lot of opposition to this, I just wanted to put out there some of the ways that people have been thinking about aid in dying. And I personally didn't grow up with a ton of conversation around this. So I'll just say, from what I understand, some of the verses, I guess, that that could be used to deny someone the ability to have their own authority in determining when they could die if they were terminally ill, are verses one in, or several, I guess, in the New Testament, but I'll just read one, which is in 1 Corinthians 3:16 through 17. And it says, "Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. For God's temple is holy and you are that temple." And so it's verses like that I have these vague memories of people sort of using that as the theological argument of someone shouldn't have, someone shouldn't be able to make the decision to die before their time because, the idea that your body is not your own and that you just have to live until God decides that it's not your time anymore. And so that's my memory of that, how that discussion went. But what else is there, Zach? I feel like you probably have more experiences and memories of how people have maybe argued this. Does that sound pretty right to you?
It does. I was taught as a kid that taking any human life is a sin. And so taking your own human life is a sin. And because you took the life and then died with that sin, having not the opportunity to repent from it, then anyone who took their own life, whether in this setting or in, any other way, would end up in hell, was what I was taught in no uncertain terms.
Yeah.
Which I think I've mentioned in a previous episode before, that my mom's explanation to me was that anyone who takes their own life, their brain typically has some issues going on. And God would see that in the same way that God would see the brain of someone with Down syndrome who doesn't have the mental capacity to understand the ancient creeds or, something like that. And it's also, as I reflect back now, I think about how those same people who would tell me that taking a life is a sin also found ways of getting around it when it was the death penalty or war. They found ways of theologically explaining those things, but not typically suicide, whether physician-assisted or otherwise, or abortion. Those were the two that were like, there's no way around that. But war and death penalty, they often found theological ways around it. And that's usually what we do, isn't it? When our worldview supports something, we find a way of making our theology support it.
So we cherry pick.
Yeah.
This part supports my conclusion, so I'm going to love this part, even if many other parts don't support it. I'll ignore those.
Yeah, and I think that what you just said, Zach, too, like that also resonates. I remember some of my early conversations saying that exact thing, like about people going to hell when they make that decision. And I think what was always absent from those conversations, though, those like theological interpretations, it seemed like there was a conflation of all the circumstances in which someone might choose to like take their life. And obviously it's like a super sensitive subject and really complicated. But I think that like a lot of what we've been talking about here right now is, the idea that like we're talking about a reduction in suffering, or like the attempt to reduce suffering, and like a focus on like quality of life rather than quantity of life, which, still tricky, still controversial, but that's really, I think, the core of what people are thinking about when they like support something like the Death with Dignity Act. And it's I think it does in a lot of cases come down to are you emphasizing quality or quantity? And it's not always easy to like separate those things out, but that's where I see the difference and maybe like the core of some of the disagreement about like whether this is a good thing.
I think I would be really interested in hearing different points of view based on profession.
Yeah.
Because I think a couple of years ago, this whole topic would have made me very uncomfortable. But death is just such a part of my life as a pastor of a primarily older congregation. All day, all week, all year, I'm with the dead and the dying, and it has lost its sting. Death itself is no longer something that really terrifies me. It's become this kind of more beautiful part of being alive. This transition that it's hard to explain, because then it makes you sound callous and a little dead inside. But I think it's one of the most beautiful experiences when I can be present with someone at the end of their life. It is this holy and sacred thin space when somebody is breathing their last breaths. So I'm not afraid of it anymore, Plus, I live with a pastor who used to be a hospice chaplain. So, like, we talk about death around the dining room table.
Just your everyday dinner conversation.
Yeah. So I almost kind of like the idea of getting to choose when you go, because then you're not worrying about the process of dying.
Adam.
Oh. Zach, what do you mean, like, death became a part of life? You said that. Which is only interesting to me because Rachel said it too. It's a... Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I'm after.
All right, so I did a CPE, which is Clinical Pastoral Education at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital in Philadelphia, and my very first day, I was training with one of the chaplains. I walked into a room because she had been called in, and the woman had died just maybe 15 minutes before we got there, and I didn't know that. And I'm standing in the room, and somebody mentions that she's dead, and I looked over at this person laying there that could have just been sleeping, but then suddenly I was aware that this person had died, and I felt so weird. And I felt so creepy because this person wasn't prepared and dressed up and, the whole like, oh, they look just like they look so good, the way you do at a viewing. This was a person that was still hooked up to machines and looked pretty bad and was dead. And it was horrifying. And there's a certain smell that comes with death. And I thought about that for days and weeks. And then I just kept going and doing it. And as a chaplain, being called when people were at the end and sitting down with people, and you kind of, I don't know, you do a scary thing a couple of times and you get through it and it's not as scary. And then once you're less afraid, you start to notice the more holy aspects of it. For example, when a person is dying and they know that they're dying and they have disavowed themselves of this mythology that they will live forever and they know that the end is near. Do you know the kinds of conversations you can have with a person in that state? They are the most honest conversations that person has ever had in their life. And to be able to just speak openly about like, hey, what do you think it's going to be like later on? Today, maybe even. What do you think? Those spaces, those conversations, it's almost like talking with an astronaut before they go off into the great expanse. You're about to go see something that I'm not going to see for a long time, and I want to talk with you about how you're feeling about it. And so I do this, and I've done this for years. And this is why most pastors would tell you they prefer funerals to weddings. There's less drama, and there's way more honesty, and it's a much more sacred and holy place, that thin space at the end of life.
I'm kind of sad Rachel's not here because I think it's like probably the like place where like we're gonna line up more than she would want to give credit for. I mean, I'll still poke at her, but especially because she's not here to defend herself. But I'm an academic. That's what we do. What I'm thinking about, Zach, is like, I think this language that both you and Rachel use, and I think it comes from a very like pastoral, I mean that in the broad sense, right? A sense of care place to delimit, to expose a place of scientific overreach, which I don't think is like what we would describe it as doing, but I think it's implicitly what's happening, right? Which is, in a science-y way, right? Life is not dead. How do you define life? It's the persistence of not dying, right? And if life is taken as that, it's terrifying to die. But that's a very, I think particularly in the 20th, 21st century, right? Like that's a very scientific way of getting at this, right? It's this sense of saying science has described for me the ways in which something is living, right? Call it biology. And what I think is interesting is that the pastoral approach that I think both you and Rachel want to take wants to put the brakes on that for a second and say, hold up. What we think of as living might not line up directly with a definition of the mechanics of a body or thing trying to continually self-perpetuate itself. And on the one hand, those sound like, okay, so that's how religion is going to do this. And on the other hand, there are these sciencey things that you can do, which are great. And, sometimes great, and sometimes we should use them, and sometimes we shouldn't. But I think what I would push on is that I think how we decide when to use and when not to use those medical and scientific interventions lines up with not how we think about death, but how we've defined life. Like by bringing death into a part of life, right? You've reframed the conversation in a way that you can't in the scientific context. Because for something to be dead, be fundamentally not to be alive, right? Whereas that binary gets broken down if you make death part of life.
At its best, one of the things that religion is supposed to do is to suppress the ego in a person. So religion is a way of connecting a person to something larger than themselves. And one of the ways that my personal religion, my faith, does that is through knowing how interconnected that I am. And I mean, in my faith, I'll call that the Holy Spirit. I will also, from my, scientifically, I'll talk about the atoms and molecules in my body that are constantly being introduced and sent back out and, reforming and fighting back against entropy in order to create this thing. But that, stars exploded a long time ago, and those star pieces made this, and they made countless other living creatures before me, and they will make so many more after me. And so the me I see as a we. I'm not so worried about the death of my ego because my religion has helped me to kill most of it anyway. And so, people talk about leaving a legacy. How will people remember me? How will I be remembered? They build these pyramids in the desert because they want to be remembered. The ego has to live on well afterwards, which completely misses the entire point of the interconnectedness of the universe and just the miracle of life. Carl Sagan said that we are a way for the universe to know itself. And I love that. I think that's so spiritually profound. At those atoms that were created in those supernovae are now able to know themselves because of this brief instance that we call Zach Jackson. And I love that. And I think of death, and this is why I said at the beginning that when I die, I want to be composted, because when you cremate someone, you lose a lot of that organic material to the combustion. When you bury someone traditionally, you don't give back. And I want 100% of what I am to go back because I want it to live on as it lived on before me.
And when you're pressed into a gemstone, similarly, you also live on.
100%.
I think there's no segue from pressing people's bodies into gemstones that I can make. I'm also thinking about the question that Rachel asked Ian and where that falls into this and like how I would think about it, and to not give the like snarky I need more information answer. Like well, I'm going to stick with my snarky like I need more information, but not in the sense of like
Okay.
in an almost snarkier sense. Don't worry, I'm going to go deeper, which is to say, like, even if you gave me the information,
Okay.
I don't know if I could answer the question, one, for anyone but myself, and two, for me, this sort of like I'm very sympathetic to this idea, Zach, that like death is part of life, right? To overcome that dichotomy, right? And that it has this, that making that movement and using religious traditions to make that movement decenters us in really, really important ways. So I am 100% on board there. It still leaves me with a big lulling question, right? Which is almost, I think, harder, which is then to say like, okay, well then how do you define that living thing? Like, how do you find that living thing that can be subject to death, and now it's not just living by being a proxy of not being dead? Like, that's the question that for me comes immediately after the very pastoral movement that I heard you and Rachel making. And I mean, I think it's exciting because I don't think there are great answers to it, but also I would take a stab at answering it, which is, I think, what makes Rachel's predicament so difficult to deal with. So I would play a language game, unsurprisingly, right? Which is to say that when we say something is living, or what it means to live, right, we can mean it in two senses grammatically. An intransitive and a transitive sense. So we can mean it as something is alive, right, as a state of situation, or we can mean it as the experience of living, right? So that it's this lived experience that one has, not a state of being something, right? So it has these two senses when we use it. And for me, I think it's getting into and being cognizant and about that sense of the lived experience that's really important. Can I identify a set of experiences that living stuff has that's essential to how I would think about whether or not I'm not actually ending my life as that 29-year-old with the brain tumor who now has pneumonia, but as the 29-year-old with the brain tumor who's now gotten pneumonia, was I already dead because I had ceased to do the things by which I would constitute having living experience? So I'm not actually dying in doing that. No one's assisting me in dying. I was already dead. Even if everybody that looks around me says, aha, you're alive because you have a heartbeat or brain function or this or that other thing. I mean, don't get me wrong. I know this goes down like an ethical gray area might not be the right description, ethical terror that can result. But I do think it's really important. It shapes the way that I think about life and what it means to live in really, really critical ways. So, sorry, now I'm monologuing, right? But like my bit here would be to say, like, my cheeky answer of like, I need more information is that, like, when Rachel puts that scenario forward, what I think about is me at 29. And at 29, I've got a 3-year-old kid. And there are a vast number of things that I desire to have in relationship to the people who are in my life at 29 that says, hell no, go treat that pneumonia. But I can also imagine a 29-year-old for whom those desires for relationships, which would be really critical to how I would define life, are really gone. And then the pneumonia is the friend that makes a death that is already realized for that person available to everyone else to mourn.
Yeah, I see a lot of what you're saying, Adam, as relevant to like the way that we kind of started in talking about like what are these different kinds of death, and that we have understandably like an overemphasis maybe on like the physical death because that's like our physical bodies are it's what everyone like sees and experiences immediately, and I guess it's like easier to make policies that affect those physical parts
they're
of
like
us
super
than
measurable,
other parts
right?
of us.
Like nobody can measure the thing that I just said.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what it like the scientific piece is. It's far from simple, but it is simpler in some cases when you're dealing with like the physical stuff. But that there is, we can talk about social death or whatever other kind of death. But I think like what you were just elaborating is like what I would call a social death of being totally disconnected, having like no support system and no drive or capacity to be connected to a community or to a support system. And, I get that can like sound a little dramatic, I guess, to say like you're socially dead if you don't have those things. But there's no denying that makes an impact on people's lives in all sorts of measurable ways that like social science has been measuring for many decades. And so that there's something about that feels really intuitive to me, even though like you said, there's also like all kinds of other ethical conundrums that come up with
also
that.
Let me just say, I'm cheating. I did write part of my dissertation on like phenomenologies of life and death, so like it's not like I just like came out with this quickly. Like, I've been thinking about it for a decade. So, yeah, I feel like I should out myself in that regard.
To do research? I should hope we all do research.
I really wish you'd come up with these answers totally on the fly. So I'm going to have to just dismiss everything you said.
Well, I learned all of my lessons about death from the School of Hard Knocks, Adam. Out on the front lines.
I will say too, though, I do think about it in personal ways, right? Like my mother has pretty severe dementia, right? Which has an interesting place within how people talk about death with dignity, right? It doesn't fit the legalistic framework that's been set up for like the death with dignity movement. And I think this sounds super cold and I don't mean it that way, but it's like in some ways sort of interesting to see the ways in which working with a person who loses mental faculties illustrates the ways in which one's life is not one's own.
Well, what is the difference? I feel like I know the answer to this, but the difference between death with dignity and a living will.
A living will just says what you want to happen to you.
Right. So, if you're in
you're in a state where that sort of thing is legal, then you could put that in your living will.
Right. Well, you make but if you're in a situation like that's where you write down you don't want any extraordinary measures or anything to take in that kind of stuff. Right.
Which, listener, if you don't have a living will, it's not hard to do, and you should definitely do it. My wife and I both have it. You never know. You never know. And it is always better for the people who are trying to take care of you if they know your wishes ahead of time and they're not
Every
left
hospital
to just
chaplain
guess.
will thank you.
Yep. And by having it written down,
Yes, every hospital chaplain will thank you.
Have it officially written down in a living will takes away all those questions.
Right. And let everyone know what you want for your funeral. My mom's been making a playlist for her funeral for years, which includes Zombie by the Cranberries, which I told her is in bad taste, but she loves that song.
That's kind of funny.
I approve that decision wholeheartedly.
Yes. She at one point wanted Time of Your Life by Green Day. She was going through something in the 90s. Until I told her that the name of the song is actually Good Riddance. And then Time of Your Life. It's a tongue-in-cheek song, despite the fact that every single graduating class in the late 90s, early 2000s used it in their graduation. It is not what you think it is.
Well, you talk about, for some reason it made me think about this, but did you all hear the story of the Irishman who died in 2019? And he set it up so that when his casket was being lowered into the grave, he had recorded himself.
Oh,
because he was a prankster. And as it's going down, all of a sudden you hear his voice being like, "Hey, let me out! Let me out!" Stuff like that.
This is the old school bells that they put on coffins, right?
Yep.
The soul bell, that, because sometimes they got it wrong that you weren't really dead, or people were afraid that they got it wrong that you weren't really dead. So you could ring a bell and they would open the casket real quick. And, usually that was gross.
Yeah. No, that is terrifying, which is why if you get pressed into a gemstone and then have the rest of your body buried as dust in a death forest, then you don't have to worry about that problem.
This is the reason why Thomas à Kempis is not a saint, despite the fact that he wrote the second best-selling Christian book of all time, The Imitation of Christ. When they exhumed his body, they found claw marks on the top of the coffin because he had been buried alive. And they said a real saint would have just accepted his death instead of fighting it. And so they never canonized him, which is BS, which is why I think I call him a saint when I think about it.
Terrifying.
In my book, he is, and that's all that matters. Right?
Oh, boy.
So, yes, dear listener, if we don't have it in our notes, look it up. Irishman pranks his family at funeral. It was hilarious to watch. But the thing is that everyone expected it.
Yeah.
Okay. So when I first read it, they all expected him to do stuff like that.
If you tell them that's what's going to happen.
I don't think he told them that he was going to do that. I think maybe a few knew, but at least they knew he was a prankster, right?
Just tell the funeral director. He loved telling
jokes, and oh my gosh, it's so funny. You see all these people just chuckling. So,
yeah,
I think I'm going to put something like that in my will. So
everyone wants that. Everyone wants people to laugh at their funeral. Everyone I have ever talked to about this, they always go, "I don't want people to cry and be sad at my service. I want people to be happy and tell stories and laugh." And every single person said this. I always tell them, "Do you think there's anyone out there who wants their loved ones to cry?" No. But we're going to, because we're going to miss you. You're not going to be there, so you really don't get a say in this. And I'm going to cry at your funeral, and there's nothing you can do to stop me. And if you want to haunt me, go ahead. I'd actually kind of like that, I think, at least for a little while. Don't do anything weird and creepy. So, my grandmom told me she doesn't want a service because she doesn't want people crying. And I said, "I don't care, grandmom." And she looked at me and she was like, "Wait, what? Wait, no, this is what I want." And I said, "I don't care because you're not going to be here. And these services are for the living and not for the dead. And there have been too many times people didn't want to burden someone else by, but don't want them to be sad. And then they don't get closure. So I'm all for respecting people's wills and wishes and all of that. But I am not above throwing a guerrilla funeral service when I need to.
Yeah.
I want it to be I like in the various cultures around the world that treat it more as a celebration of life. Mm-hmm. Where they still have the moment in the funeral or something where it is sad and things like that, but that it is I remember when I was Peace Corps volunteer in Jamaica, that was what someone was explaining to me. It's a celebration of that person's life.
I learned recently that the Orthodox Church has an annual feast on the day of a person's death for the first couple of years. And so you get your family back together, you have a big meal, and you share stories of that person on the anniversary of their death. And I think that's spectacular.
And if you're the dead one, that's a great opportunity to haunt people.
Absolutely.
So efficient.
Yeah.
We're all there.
That's what everybody longs for.
Just get them all in one place.
Takes a lot of energy to haunt, Adam.
Yeah.
I will have to say, Zach, that I do feel like this conversation was probably a little bit more uplifting than the conversation about middle age.
Which is hilarious, right? And a part of that, I think, is because I wasn't there.
I feel
also.
happier after this one than I did at the last one.
The middle age conversation was about the fear of death. And this one is about the
just
acceptance of death.
welcoming
And
it
once you've
with
accepted it, it's great.
Yeah, I was gonna end with a quote that was gonna bring us back down, but I guess I'll just leave that off because I feel like we're in a good place.
No, go ahead. Bring it.
No, I don't know that it fits. It also takes us back to like tier management theory, which we've kind of not really been talking about. So this is good.
Okay. Well, we can end our series with an announcement then. That this is the last episode in this mini-series, which will bring us to, I think, just about our 2-year anniversary. And so in celebration of that, and also because we have a whole bunch of professors that are going to be doing a lot of transitioning in this period, and a rabbi who will be entering into high holy days, and me, who's just doing stuff, we're gonna put up some of our favorite episodes from the first 2 years. And so if you missed them, or if you just want to listen to them again, because I've been listening to some of the older episodes, and there's some
made of
gems
Kendra
in there.
Mm-hmm.
And then
They're made
after
of
that,
Kendra.
when we're going to... What's that?
Yeah.
They're made of... Oh, because they're gems.
Because
Got
they're
it.
gems.
Ah, that was a callback. I
bum.
got you, Adam.
Very well played.
So when we come back from that, we've got a whole slate of new interviews and a new format for the show that will focus around storytelling and a variety of new segments, which we're excited to bring you, which may or may not include books we've read or demons that we've loved or dead Christians we want to tell fun stories about.
And listener questions.
Just going to leave you with that. And listener questions. Oh, yeah, that's the important one. So we've got a lot in store for year 3, and we're excited to bring it to you.
Fun times.
Yay.
You got to end it with that.